It's very active on our Signal chat.
Good. All right, so I think we've got a good quorum still with us online. Thank you, everyone who's hanging out with us. Please, over to you, Elizabeth, to talk about the government white paper listening session.
Yeah, so whereas the last session was a lot of information, this one is going to be ideally a lot of discussion with those of you who are on the line. I think it's probably going to be a lot of conversation with the team on the line. So please do feel free to unmute yourselves and add to the conversation as and when you want to jump in. So Mark and I are both working hard on a newly scope, or we're kind of in the scoping phase really of what this white paper is going to be about. But what we are looking to do is really to advise and engage government officials who are working on designing identity solutions, and just present them with our take on the moving landscape of identity and what themes they should be thinking about, and hopefully start a conversation with those government officials and further the discussion. Okay, oh, it's not letting me move forward, and I'm just going to pause a moment while I fix that. Okay, I fixed it. Well done, me. Okay, so this is what we're going to talk about today. We're going to really go kind of back to basics about the underpinnings and the theory that at the moment underpins the paper that we're writing. And I would really love for people on the line to shout out where maybe we have biases or where we are not thinking broadly enough about what the government is looking to achieve with digital identity solutions, or just really anything. Please speak out if you think that we're focusing too narrowly or too broadly. So I'm going to just lay out some basic assumptions for you. So let's say identity underpins government's core purposes in many ways. And government, if they're seeking to ensure the well-being of citizens underpinned by sustainable growth and resilience, identity is going to be crucial to that. It plays an incredible role in cyber resilience, in business resilience, in economic resilience, political resilience, human resilience, each of those examples. So, businesses suffering cyber attacks, those small businesses find it hard to bounce back. But it's more than that, really. Misinformation online, bot attacks, fake reviews can really stifle a business, and that's not good from a government perspective that's seeking to grow the economy and sustain the economy. So this is really, identity plays a crucial role. Now is the moment where I need to stop talking and just pause and say, is this closed-minded in any way? What would you say about our assumptions about the role of government and how identity fits in? What should we be thinking about? I'm going to open the chat, but please, if you want to participate, don't limit yourself to chat. We've got a small audience in the room, so please feel free to jump in.
I looked at this last night and I'm like, okay, that looks good. Does anyone think this doesn't kind of resonate, doesn't kind of fit?
I guess I'll just think out aloud here.
Go for it.
The part about the resilience and the government that resonates with me. But can you say a little bit where identity then connects to that piece?
Resilience?
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah, like the heading of the slide and the body of the slide, how do they connect?
Well, I mean, I've considered changing the center of that to identity, because it plays a role in all those different types of resilience, right? Like cyber resilience, the prevention of fraud. Identity is fundamental to that. The prevention of fake reviews on a website that stifle a small business owner's ability to compete. The presentation of misinformation about political stuff. Et cetera, et cetera. So economic resilience, so the ability to know whether money is flowing from an identifiable individual to another identifiable individual or an arms trader. Identity is central to that. So it really plays a role in each one of these things. The ability to understand whether somebody is a legitimate benefits applicant during the PPP rollout, for example, identity.
couple more examples I could chuck in your direction if it would help, Elizabeth.
Please.
Yeah, from the economic resilience perspective and societal resilience, ensuring that the correct individuals are paying their tax is another really key thing. And it's not just individuals, but organizations as well. So,
did you say tax? I'm
tax,
sorry.
yes.
Thank you.
And sorry.
No, go ahead.
I'll just share one last thought. I've also been talking in the last couple of working groups I've been involved in the OpenID Foundation with our chairman, Matt Sakamura, who's sharing that the OECD and a number of governments are increasingly interested in age protection rules as well, which again, whatever your views on that are, do clearly rely on some attributes relating to identity as well.
You're talking about child protection, really, online.
Yeah, child protection, yeah, online child protection, and in real life. I mean, going and supporting your local sports club by being a coach requires identity verification and checks. It's not just online. I've done that several times myself in my life, and it's a delightful paper form in this country. I don't know how it works everywhere else.
This is Michael McCaskill. One of the things, and I guess I need to ask the question of from what perspective government are you referring? Is this federal? Is this state? Is this any government?
That's a really wonderful question. I have a slide for that, but let's cover it now. We're really thinking broadly about it, but the question you raise is a fantastic one. Governments are not a monolith. They comprise different layers and they comprise different departments, and each of those departments may play one or more role in an identity ecosystem. So at the moment, we're kind of exploring whether that scope should be narrowed or whether we take a very high, 10, 50,000 foot view of the government and can just consider that challenge that they have as a non-monolith with all these different entities and roles within them. Does that make sense?
It does, from the perspective of, at least in the US, from the perspective of the state governments, they both use and provision identity.
Absolutely.
And they see that as a public good in the way that the state government works. And then in the US, the federal government consumes that identity and makes it, because the states are taking such pains to make sure they've got the right identity issued because it is a public good. So I think depending on what your perspective is, you may have to talk about both of those in this paper.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. And for those who don't know Mike, he's with AMBA. So thanks for joining us, Mike and Lafi today. So
there's another thought I just want to just share on that one off the back of Mike's comment. I think I agree completely with Elizabeth that we're trying to make this as wide-ranging in its utility as possible. We're absolutely trying to make this of use to governments outside the US as well. I'm sure you intended that and understood that, Mike. But one of the interesting threads of conversation around that is ultimately the systems of law that underpin the governments are, I think, fall into largely different categories, two of which being, the common law base, which the US and the UK use, and the Code Napoleonique originating from France and use in a number of different jurisdictions. So we need to allow for that important kind of legal basis difference as well.
There is an implicit assumption that the government itself is a good actor when you're making this statement. And I don't think you can write the paper any other way.
Yes.
But maybe make that turn that from an implicit to an explicit.
No, that's definitely the goal of putting this assumption out here. We're gonna, so not only do I want feedback on whether we're focused too narrowly, but we are definitely going to be putting out in the paper like a section where we say these are the explicit assumptions we are making about the nature of the government and their intentions. Hello.
Hi, I mentioned one thing in my presentation yesterday, and I believe it was David Turner who brought it up in one of the keynotes on Monday as well, and that is digital outsidership. And that is for all the people who can't get digital identities. And we are discussing that very much internally with the Norwegian government and also with other third parties. Is that something that you are thinking of bringing into the scope of this white paper, or is that maybe too broad?
No, let me make sure I understood correctly. So you're talking about undocumented citizens? Is that?
Both undocumented citizens and people who don't have digital lives at all, like my grandmother who is 85 years old.
Yeah, that's that is interesting. I think our answer would be yes. We are thinking of bringing certainly the undocumented conversation into the paper. That's definitely one of the goals is to enable citizens to get access to identity, a foundational identity. And then in terms of those who don't have digital lives, I think we need to start from a place where we're considering them and then work our way into like, do we narrow the scope? Do we need to narrow the scope? Because I don't think we've actually had that conversation yet.
Yeah, I think one interesting part of it is those who are digitally deprived because they can't make use of the current digital services available for whatever reason, and those that won't by choice. And that might give us a way to reflect on those quite radically different groups.
Even if we don't have like sort of technical solutions to offer to that community, we should recognize that they exist in the paper. Yeah, thank you. I will. I'll flip on to the next slide, but please feel free to keep. We had a question at the back. I saw a hand. You had a hand raised, didn't you? Same comment. Okay, thank you. All right, so one of the pieces that we've touched on is the nature of identity. Shout out to Heather Flanagan for creating that visual graphic. I really liked it because I like how it kind of looks like a tapestry and also gets the point across. Our paper is starting from a foundational assumption that there are different aspects of our identity and that they are salient in different parts of our lives, different moments, different contexts, and that we have rights about when and how to assert those identities. So there are definitely other perspectives on identity out there in the world, but this is sort of a fair representation of how our paper is starting. And GDP, a lot of what we're thinking in terms of baseline assumptions, like I think can be reflected in GDPR legislation, the GDPR legislation. Do you feel like this is a safe place for us to start in our assumptions about what identity is? Do we need to be thinking differently, more? Are there other perspectives on identity out there that we must be reflecting in this paper, in your opinion? Are we leaving anyone out?
Well, I'll just riff for a minute and say the concept of consent I've heard in many forums. So whether it's health and the sharing of medical records, like the concepts of consent are quite complex in the healthcare domain and clearly apply also in the financial services domain. So having, I think that's referenced in there somewhere implicit when you're talking about the relationships between sibling and parent or employer and employee and so forth. So I think that's helpful. And then the reference to GDPR and similarly CCPA legislation, there's some sense that those kinds of policies will start to continue to cascade around the world and user consent-based release of data. But then the problems that go past that, it's more than just the authorization to give consent, but what happens with that data, the data minimization capabilities on the other side of that exchange.
Mm. There's some chats coming. I'm just going to read the chats. Oh, Mark's responding to the chats.
I'd like to be useful.
What's been going on? Can you summarize?
Coffee, did you want to chime in or?
Well, I think everything's covered in the chat. Was making the point that it might be helpful to think about government in two ways. One is as an issuer, and another is as a relying party, especially for people that or entities that are eventually going to use the information coming out of this exercise, because they're typically different entities and they're responsible for different things. And I think Mark pointed out that, yes, this is indeed something that is being considered. So thank you, Mark.
Yeah. I'll say it again. I have a slide for that, and perhaps this time I'll move to it.
That'll help.
That'll help. Government has multiple roles and concerns within an identity ecosystem. We've already sort of talked very briefly about the layers of government and the different, the fact that government is not a monolith. It has layers and it has different departments with different needs and interests in an ID ecosystem. And sometimes it plays one or more of, at least 3 to 4 roles, right? It can be issuing identities where it's worried about, who is this person and how do I issue this identity and know that it will, bind to that individual? How will I recognize them when they turn? And obviously, how will we keep this data safe, scalable, secure, et cetera? Then there's, on the other side, there's the RP or verifier role where they need to know that, they need to consume an identity in order to authorize them for actions taken within government systems. I mean, sort of between those two roles is, issuance is different from sort of being the entity that is sort of, you might phone home to verify that that is the same person. I'm trying not to use the word verifier there because I know that word takes on multiple meanings in different contexts, but all those roles are important. And then of course, they also play the role of the regulator, the one that has oversight for ensuring that there are standards in place, that there are ethical guardrails, that citizens' data is kept private, secure. And they're also interested in ensuring that identity ecosystems are delivering those goals that we talked about before: economic growth, stability, resilience, well-being. And in order to achieve that, they need to ensure citizens adopt these ID credentials or programs. And again, that the whole thing is kept secure, scalable, resilient. What's missing? What haven't we thought of?
Well, I'll just comment maybe on the first column to say that I'm hearing some question marks around the left-hand side of the page, like how government is thinking about being the issuing authority as well as being the system of record to which third-party or private entities have that direct access. And an environment emerges where you can have synthetic or derived, sorry, I should use the term derived identities that can be derived either from a system of record or it can be derived from a digital identity credential issued by the government. So the example would be, you have a mobile driving license issued to Arizona, and then that resident in Arizona presents that to Amazon, and Amazon turns around and creates a derived credential, the Amazon credential, and then presents that to people as their own service. Or you have a system of record check in the US, it's something like DLDV or other source record checks with the DMV, or same with the Social Security Administration. You check a set of information and then go through your own proprietary process to determine whether you think that that person is definitely who they say they are. And those source systems of record were developed in one framework, usually for one type of specific action, like checking in insurance, car insurance is appropriate, but not necessarily for the purpose of a derived credential that was a persistent, how to play the persistent role. So I think there's some really interesting questions that could be worth getting into, because the government has an implicit responsibility in both cases.
Anyone on the line want to get into those? I'm not sure who we have out there.
I guess I'll respond with,
Thank you.
I agree with Gail that the government wears both hats. Actually, they wear all three hats on this slide, depending on what level or what part of the government you're in. They're either a verifier, relying party, they're certainly an issuer, and then they also regulate how that data within at least state jurisdictions or country jurisdictions gets handled. So I think it's important that, and this may play more into what Lafi was saying in the chat, dividing these up and speaking to them individually may be easier than trying to put these all together and speak to them as a government / relying party kind of thing. So it may be better to break these out, to have a better discussion around what each one of those mean. If that makes any sense.
It does.
I agree. I agree. I think it's kind of heavy and loaded. I think maybe in a very small country, you might have all of those people work super closely together. But in the reality of large markets, there's numerous issuers. There's many different, excuse me, systems of record. There's a very large number of different departments acting as the verifiers at different levels of government. And there can be many different regulators depending on the vertical, right? It's not just one regulator. So I think that's agreed, Mike, is the benefit of fleshing that out, each of those roles and the challenges faced there. I think the beginning of the paper, we're just trying to get a hand around, well, what's the right landscape to be talking about? Do we reference passkeys? Do we reference zero trust? These are all kind of hot terms. The government officials are flooding to FedID and say, well, what's happening in identity? What does decentralized identity mean? What does a mobile driving license mean? What does a passkey mean? Like there's a learning curve that, on my observation, a few government officials have their hands around, but a large number of them don't. And even amongst private sector experts, not that many experts really have a handle on all different aspects of the identity domain. So it's
And what the citizen
complicated.
journey would look like as they
And how do you
encounter-
future-proof? That
Yeah.
citizen journey.
Yeah.
Maybe this is more common actually to the previous slide, but where you said that, it's my identity, but I share some limited rights to the data with the government, and that's maybe one of the roles it also has. That I'm not sure which of those three hats that would fit under. I remember conversations had with folks working in the MDL space, and we're talking about digital driver's licenses and how should they work, and should I be allowed to have them on all my devices or just one device, and the discussion sort of went in the direction of some of us would argue, well, what do users want? Do they want them on one? It's, after all, it's their identity, right? What do they want? And the other part of the room was arguing, no, it's not their identity, it's the government's, it's the government ID. They own the identity, they get to decide these kind of rules. And so, which I thought was an interesting discussion that maybe reminds me of your previous slide that you had.
Yeah.
And so I think maybe my question is for this paper here, are you trying to, is this a position paper? Here's what we think. Like, we think it's the person's data with some limited rights, or are you trying to be as non-controversial as possible? And well, if some governments somewhere think that they are the owners of identity, then let's write that down.
That's a wonderful question. And I think that really is why I put this slide out here, because at least as I and as Mark, I think you share, we might not align, I think we do. We're putting out there our assumption going into the paper that identity data broadly is something owned in a sense by the individual with limited shared rights with that entity who issued it. But we're at a listening session for a reason, to try and understand whether that's too limiting, whether we're considering our scope and the way that we ground it. Don's got something to say.
No, I was just reflecting on the way that you frame the paper is really beginning with the nature of government vis-a-vis identity. And now this is the nature of identity vis-a-vis government. And Gail's comment just underscored something that I think we all believe, which is that government officials, government regulators are for the most part ill-equipped to really understand some of the technology that is related to identity. And so, Dirk, I would hope that one goal of this paper would be simply an educational resource for government officials that have identity in their portfolio. And the fact that it comes from a nonprofit global standards organization may make it more salient or more useful. I think that's one of the real world benefits of a paper like this. Just keep offering them opportunities and white papers and gatherings like this to find out where problems can be addressed now and in the future.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I think the goal is a little bit to be that resource, right? So something that is hopefully considered an unbiased, to the best ability that we can, unbiased resource on what is happening in the landscape and what are the choices. And if there are recommendations, that it's set in context.
Yeah.
And
If
So,
not unbiased,
sorry.
at least, let me just finish, Mark. and then
Yeah,
I'll-
sure.
I'm not done.
If not, I'm sorry, I'll let you finish first.
So I also was going to reference it. Lafayette said that an identity is essentially verified by the government, right? It's questionable. I think you said questionable philosophically as a statement to say that the individual has that complete control over that information if it's the government issued information. And I'd actually put a bit of a spin on that and say this is about a social contract. I think we're predominantly looking at the social contract between the resident of a given jurisdiction and that government authority. How does that social contract play out as relates to identity? Yeah. But we do need that, whatever the right definition is. I think that's what we have to agree as a community makes sense.
Yeah. And I don't think that we can claim to be unbiased here, but I think we can at least state what our assumptions are and be as bias conscious as we can. And one of the beautiful things I heard you explaining to Drummond yesterday was about how what we really want is for people to be able to respond to this paper, right? And to start a conversation with papers of their own. So if we're bias conscious and stating these are our assumptions about what identity is, and these are our assumptions about what the government is and how identity fits in, then that just opens the door for someone to write their paper that says, you guys are full of it. This is what the government cares about, and this is what identity is. And that just benefits the whole general knowledge base. I'm sorry, Mark, your turn.
That's quite all right. So I had been going to draw attention to Rafi's comment as well, but actually not just out of sheer generosity to Rafi, who's helping us by dropping the comments in, but because I think there's another way of addressing how to get the citizens' interests aligning with the governmental interests, regardless of who owns the data. And I've got big air quotes going on here. What matters actually to the government official is adoption and use of it, I think. And one of the really powerful things that I think we should be helping the government stakeholders involved reflect on is that if it's not sufficiently useful and easy to use, then there's not going to be the adoption, and the whole enterprise will be reduced in value as a result. So that was an area I was thinking we might take the conversation in the paper as well.
And I'd like to add to that, Mark, if I may.
Yeah.
I'd take that a step further or actually back maybe. Yes, adoption is important, but more important in the government sector would be, pardon me, data security and privacy and trust in the credential that's issued, whether it be physical or digital, because that's part of the government's piece in this is assuring the relying parties that the identity that they're interacting with has been validated and verified and assigned in a manner that can be trusted. So
Certainly.
yes, adoption's important, but you don't get adoption if they don't trust it. So I think more important is the privacy, security, and the trust, so that you obtain that adoption.
And it feels to me like adoption by the citizens and adoption by the relying parties is are concerns that we need to bring to the front of mind, because often I think in historical projects, the interests of the government itself, whatever they define them as, are prime, and they forget that making it of utility and trusted by the other stakeholders in the overall ecosystem and the overall economy is as important. So I think we're very closely aligned on that, probably.
Sounds like it.
Yeah.
Don, did you raise your hand?
What were the two biases that you just, I missed them. I was interested.
Oh, the nature of identity and the nature of government.
Okay.
But I'm sure there are more biases as well, right? That we need.
Well,
that we
I
need.
think I spoke to one, which is we have a bias or an assumption that government regulators and officials need this information from this source.
Mm,
I think that's true. And I think about, I mean, Google has a massive government education effort. What we have is a brand that is maybe complementary to, or even in some cases more helpful to government officials, because we represent a broad cross-section, nonprofit, et cetera.
mm.
So I think we can speak directly to those government officials in this paper.
Yeah, I think so too. I hope so. All right, so I've moved on a slide because we sort of started to touch on like the what keeps you up at night, and like what are the hot burning issues, and we started to talk about data security and trust as a precondition for adoption. And so I thought that I would just progress to this slide and open it up. Like, can we dig a little deeper into those things? What are the U is addressed to, of course, anyone who is from the government or has other insight into what is keeping government stakeholders up at night, and the impact of not solving those problems. So let's just start there. I'll see if anyone has any responses.
And a time check, let's call it 5 minutes. We might run a little bit behind on yours, Heather.
I don't want to deprive Heather of her time. She made the pretty picture.
I'll opine on the second one there, and
Thank you.
I would say that, you know, the risk of not solving these problems, one of them is what you had on your opening slide, is that the resiliency of these systems is at risk,
Yeah.
if we don't solve these problems. But I think there's also a flip side there, is that on the other hand, maybe privacy is also at risk, right? If we solve these problems in a way where identity means everybody's transparent all the time, the way we address fraud in economics is by making everything, everybody's
Putting all of our
identity very
identities on a
transparent.
public blockchain.
Hmm?
Nothing. Sorry,
So-
go
sorry.
ahead. I did.
So to me, I feel like the risk is that it derails on sort of either end of that spectrum, and the challenge is to keep us sort of in the middle there.
So
Yeah.
like keeping, okay. So there are unintended consequences of anything that we, that definitely keeps me up at night.
So the risk of not solving the problems and those consequences, but also the risks of attempting to solve the problems and do that poorly.
Yeah.
Right.
Thank you. I saw another hand over there. I don't know if it's Victoria or man in cap, whose name I don't know. See you. No.
So I think these are probably a set of questions. We'll keep asking some of these. We want to take today's discussion on board, and we'll have another listening session before IIW at the OpenID Foundation Working Group, and then amongst the wider forum at IIW itself. So
Yeah.
probably going on to the final next steps, because we're not expecting to answer everything today, right? It's just
No.
the first of a series of listening sessions.
Yeah, first of a series of listening sessions. I do have one more slide about the role and limits of standards. And this is just, it's another assumption that we have coming into the paper, which is, that standards play an important role, proven tools, and work together in an ecosystem. I sense that you want me to get off the.
Maybe just to note that the OpenID Foundation is definitely trying to facilitate a conversation beyond the scope of our own standards, right? So to be a safe space to kind of talk
For
about
sure.
these topics in a somewhat standards agnostic manner.
Yes.
I think that's kind of the key point. So
Yeah.
standards play a role, but it's not.
Perfect. So next steps, I don't have a slide for that actually, but next steps are really that we're going to continue the listening sessions, talking to IIW. We're going to be meeting with a number of different stakeholders. If you know anybody that we need to talk to get this paper right, please point them in our direction. Or if you are someone that we need to talk to in order to get this paper right, please point yourself in my direction or Mark's direction. I would love to talk to you. And with that, I'm going to hand over to Heather or to Gail to introduce.
Just one more next step, Elizabeth, if I may.
Yeah.
We're going to be working on a draft, and if I remember the timelines correctly, towards the end of December, we'll be sending it out for wider stakeholder review. That's the only other thing.
Thank you, Mark.
Thank you, Mark. So happy to introduce Heather Flanagan, who many of you know has been a thought leader in the standards world and facilitator for quite some time. So we're delighted to have Heather acting as lead editor of this government credential privacy white paper. Well, we'll come up with exactly the right name for it, right, Heather? So delighted to have Heather facilitate our next session, kind of similarly have a bit of a listening session. And hopefully, I think we have already our friends from AMVA who've been participating in this session. They're planning to lean in and contribute actively to the privacy white paper. And hopefully we'll have our friends at EPIC also dialing in. And I'm not sure Kantara can make it today, but there are 4 nonprofits who are collectively trying to facilitate this piece of work so that a bit to Dirk's point, we actually can take some action and try and avoid the worst of the pitfalls, including the many privacy consequences. So thank you, Heather.
So I actually know most of you. Hi. One of the open and like the warning shot across the bow for I think this white paper is that privacy is too big to wrap our arms around. So we're drilling down on government issued credentials in the privacy landscape. Does that mean it solves the privacy issue? No, they don't. Do they add to the privacy issue? Maybe, but it's one aspect of it that we're trying to grapple with. One bite of the elephant, as it were, in privacy. So one implicit assumption here is that privacy is by many, but not all, considered a public good. And this slide changed from when I first created it, because I originally thought in the little tiny letters there to stress out Vittorio because the contrast isn't high enough. It originally said something along the lines of course, you want to give users more control of their privacy, and that being an ideal end state. And the feedback I got was, well, maybe not. Maybe it isn't the governments don't want to just give the end user complete control over their information, because maybe they're not making the best choices when they have that control. And if the government is in fact here to help, maybe that assumption itself is something that you need to step back and think about how it's implemented. So in the space of government issued credentials, there's several things that exist now, but they're like these wonderful little islands. There are biometric databases, over here. There's different national identifier schemes over here. There's digital identity components that consume one or more of those or not. You know, it's like depends on where you are around the world. And one of the things to consider is that, you know, just because those credentials now exist in different governments around the world doesn't mean that the individual can actually count on them. They can't count on having access to their own information, or that other relying parties can access the information as needed. There's no certainty that relying parties are going to be held accountable to the information that's being held by the government. And what are the relying parties going to actually do with it downstream? There's some fun thoughts about, okay, so you've got these credentials and you want them to be globally viable, an internet scale thing. And all of us have worked in the standard space long enough to know that internet scale is really hard. And it gets even harder when you say, and by the way, I want very localized control for all of the capabilities that we're talking about. That's a hard thing to balance. And another thing that you can't necessarily count on, and we're trying to find the balance for, is there's this world of legal protection, contracts, laws and regulations. And then there's the world of how do you actually enforce that in the technology itself? What's the intersection there? These are the kinds of things that I'm actually starting to just ask myself as I'm looking at this paper, and adding a follow on to that of, okay, so we're looking at government issued credentials, sure, but in some areas of the world, there's now derived credentials from these. Should we be capturing that in this paper, in the privacy landscape? The fact that some countries allow third parties to take the government issued credential and do stuff? What do you think? Should we include that in this paper, derived credentials? Raise your hand if you think yes.
PII claims from the original credentials?
Let's say yes. Okay. Okay.
By that, Mike, are you meaning you have a DMV, they have a system of record, it has their driving license number? Does that count as PII that was from the original credential? Like, it is the source record. It's like the plastic is a manifestation of that, a digital identity credential is a manifestation of that, and then there's the system of record, which is the origin source of both. So it depends on what lens you use. The way that so if you have a real life example right now is American Airlines with their partner Airside Mobile is consuming data on driving licenses from the DLDV, which is hosted by AMBA, longstanding platform. And they're consuming that information to determine whether an American Airlines passenger has a record held by DLDV, and then they can go through the biometric checks and other activities to say, yes, high level of confidence, and then create a derived credential that can be then presented to TSA, and TSA would allow that person to go through. So it's not a directly government issue credential, but it's doing something that looks like and smells like the exact same thing as a mobile driving license or what could be a verifiable credential version of that, but it's not, right? That particular government didn't decide that it was issued for that particular purpose of TSA acceptance. It was maybe indirectly approved through AMBA's governance process or allowed.
Gail,
Yeah, please.
I just need to clarify a couple of things.
Oh,
that
please,
you
yeah.
just referenced. First off, the DLDV doesn't house any data, and it's only a mechanism to send the state of record information that the state of record then sends back a yes, no, doesn't verify anything other than that. So that's the first point of reference. Second point of reference is in the American Airlines case, what's happening is they're using the credential that's issued by I think you alluded to, using the credential issued by the state, getting the data by taking pictures of that front and back, taking that data, scraping it, and then taking that data and sending it through DLDV to the state of record to verify that they have a data set that exists in their database with that data in it. There's no picture that goes back and forth, so there's no way to fully identify the person who is actually trying to get the American Airlines credential. So I just didn't want the group to think DLDV housed data.
Yeah, thank you so much for the correction. So I don't, at risk of dwelling too much on a particular example. But I think the abstraction that I would take from it is that either way, do you think about derived credentials? Is it part of the scope of the paper? To me, the question is there an element of government accountability for these different channels that the data that they're releasing is empowering relying party transactions broadly in society, right? And so I think that it matters to the paper. We initially scoped it as government issued credentials, but it's like you have a, in business school language, you say there's a substitute, there's an alternative, there's a competitive technical platform, there's other ways to do exactly the same thing. Then it feels like you kind of need to look at them both.
It's out of scope for the paper, but it's an interesting concept to me because this happens all the time in research and education, where you have the home organization, the university or the college, who has the source of truth for is this person a student, a faculty, a staff, what's their email, what, all the identifying information. But then you get these research organizations like the physicists who are studying gravitational waves and others, and they have a collaboration platform that brings in a lot of different groups, and they need to know that that person is in fact a member of an institution that signed a common MOU, but the institution doesn't release quite enough data. And so they in a way create their own record based on verified information, and then they decorate it with, and in our arena, this person is actually a PI for this particular project where the institution might not have that. And that's considered like fundamentally necessary to the research space. Okay, so one of the ways I've described this this area of work is that you have policy and you have government regulation, but you also have your protocols, and the intersection of those two is a very uncomfortable and untidy place right now. So looking at this from the protocol perspective, and how could protocols actually do something to technically enable enforcement? What could happen here? Well, there's a lot of questions about that. Authentication protocols are providing some really useful guidelines about sign-in. At the moment of sign-in, what's happening? What information is being shared? Great. But what happens after that? Is that something that can only be addressed by regulation? Or is that something that could be addressed by the specifications themselves? I don't know. I would like opinions on that. What if we were going to have this paper not just provide feedback to government agencies, but also to people writing specs? What could we suggest to say, here's how the spec writers could actually be a part of making this space a little bit better? And we all think about that and sit with it for a moment.
Let's see. We certainly already talk about consent for release of data during authentication actions and the subsequent, for instance, user info retrieval.
Is that enough?
I don't know. I mean, the privacy landscape is changing. We're in the process of rechartering the Jose working group to do zero knowledge proofs and all the fancy crypto because there's more appetite for it than there used to be. I will think about it.
It's a good thing to think about. Yes.
So I can read this question in two different ways, and I wonder which way it's meant. One is, I could imagine that we're asking ourselves, presenting identity attributes about myself. Let's say I just proved to you that I'm over 18, and then I present to you also maybe the country I live in or something, and then I present to you like which gender I am or something. Each attribute taken by themselves is not terribly identifying, but once you combine them all, it becomes more and more identifying. Is the question here, should we build something to the protocols that would somehow alert the user, somehow, you know, build privacy into that? That's one way I can read the question. The other way I can read the question is that, let's say I have a verifiable credential. I'm represented as the holder of the credential as a DID in that verifiable credential. And now I make a privacy preserving presentation that proves just that I'm over 18, just that one bit, but it leaks the DID as part of that to you, which, if I understand correctly, sort of where we're at currently with the mechanisms that we have invented so far. And then I go to the next person. So now I release to you more than just that I'm over 18. I also release like a correlatable, trackable identifier, which is my DID. That's the other way I could read that. Which way is the question meant?
I don't know.
Okay. Maybe both.
Maybe both.
Right.
In a way, that's why I threw some of these questions here to see what it made you think about. And
Heather, yeah, sorry, Karen.
Go ahead.
I was kind of interested in this area because I think most of the user community have no concept of what we're talking about here. And before you can have a protocol at any of these layers, that kind of implies there needs to be some sort of intent expressed by the end user. And for them to have an intent, they kind of need to understand this stuff. I think it is increasing over time because of coverage in the media and, you know, individual experiences and what have you. But I still think the vast majority of people, A, don't have the understanding, and B, kind of don't really want to be bothered with it. You know, a lot of them don't have, can't spare the brain cycles, as it were, or won't, or won't, right? So a crazy little side story. My favorite taxi driver, when I met him 3 years ago, didn't have a bank account and didn't want a bank account. It was too much trouble. We start asking him how he'd like his data to be treated. I think he might just go down the pub because that's more interesting to him. I
actually question your initial assumption. What now? I don't know if this is possible, but what if you set up something so that the data automatically expired? That's not something you ask the user about. That's just, you know, something that you could build into the protocol saying this data is, you know, the RP can't just collect it and hoard it and correlate all the things. There's going to be something built in the protocol that says this data will expire. The user wouldn't get asked about that. And Vittorio has raised his hand.
Sorry, I really cannot contain myself.
Oh, good.
I think that here we have an opportunity to fix one issue that we have as an industry, in which we often suggest that protocols can make things that they really cannot do. Like in this particular case, things to the effect of providing an affordance in the protocol to assert that a certain piece of data will expire does very little to protect from the privacy perspective. Let's say that the authority might say, I don't guarantee the fact that this attribute is true beyond a certain date, but if the thing that we are trying to prevent is undue disclosure or spreading and similar, that won't help. And I think that what we can do is to tell the regulator that if they decide to create laws that establish, for example, that a certain provider shouldn't keep that stuff around for a while, the protocol might provide the counterparts to signal those intent and like provide the transport for this. But without the regulation, the protocol can do absolutely nothing. And also, there is an obligation for us as technologists to create protocols that don't introduce situations in which you can do correlations and similar, but we need to be realistic and tell people that chances are that the actual operation that you will do will include all those things. You can do magical verifiable credentials with exotic identifiers that change every few minutes. But if I'm buying something and I have to share my home address because you have to ship the stuff, then all of these will be for naught. So again, that doesn't relieve our burden to make sure that the protocols don't introduce correlations, but we should also not give to the people the illusion that the protocol can enforce any of this, especially for governments. It's on them to say, this is what I want to happen in reality, and then we can help, but we cannot solve.
So well said. Can I test an example of what could be working and see if this would pass the bar, Vittorio? So if you have the example where you have GDPR legislation or CCPA legislation saying you have a right to be forgotten, right? Then the protocol and the platforms that are put in place can offer the feature, the capability to retract your rights. So you assert, you do a presentation online, in person, doesn't matter. You give that data over to the relying party, and then you go through a second transaction later to say, I want to assert my right to be forgotten now. And you can use your audit trails, you can do other types of things. And then because you've given that clear right, you had history of the transaction you've done, you asserted your right to be forgotten. There's then the mechanism through the courts to say, did that particular institution delete my information? They prove the negative, I don't know, but like, have they actually gone through the process of removing my information so it's no longer there? Is that the connection between the law and
that
the
absolutely
practice?
works? Let's say that without the law that says you relying party must provide an affordance for the user to say, forget my stuff, nothing in the protocol would actually enforce it. Here, it's all hinging on the government saying, relying party, if you don't do this, you're going to be fined out of existence. And that is what will create the incentive for people to adopt whatever tools we offer them. But very often, especially when you talk to the decentralized people, they tend to suggest that instead their protocol and their smart contracts can magically make this thing happen, which unfortunately isn't true. So that's the thrust behind my argument. You're absolutely right. GDPR is a very good example.
Can I just add that this isn't always federal regulation and enforcement. Sometimes this could be trust frameworks, which can actually provide frameworks outside of those kind of geographic boundaries, as well as quicker reaction to those sort of things. But the protocols can provide the bits that those rules and those kinds of enforcements need. If someone says, if you correlate, you need to also provide the right to be forgotten for everyone you shared that data with, people throw up their hands and say, there is no technical approach to do this once I've shared the data. If we provide that technical approach, they can't do that anymore.
So
it's kind of like,
wait, because he's been trying to say something.
Responding to Vittorio's comment, protocols have been known to provide transparency, certificate transparency, but the knowledge that the request was made to remove the data and prove that it was can be federated or can be shared publicly, and that could be part of the protocol.
that was similar thought where I was going down, was like, what is the assertion back from that relying party to say, I have indeed deleted that information, right? So there's a trail, two-way, yeah.
And then if someone says, prove to me that you deleted the data and they haven't kept any of the data, they can't prove anything. Cool. Slightly different thing to think about, of course, is governments are very interested in dealing with preventing fraud. And that is a good thing, but it also introduces its own challenge. So in the previous talk, we talked a little bit about how increasing privacy is a balance to other aspects of what we were trying to do here. And you want to find the middle ground. And talking about how the fraud components would fit into all this was an interesting thought and interesting question that came up in some conversation. So I wanted to toss that in here and see how anybody reacted to that.
Exposing data is not always against the interests of the individual.
True.
Just throwing it out there. So an interesting example, I think, some of the wording of the new UK or the proposed UK framework was, I think, a previous version suggesting that there should be consent every time digital identity data is processed. And actually what that was going to prevent was the credit checking agencies providing the protections that they do for people's financial and data exchanging services, protections against fraud in particular.
Mm-hmm.
I know that's, it's not in line with the privacy is always good kind of theme that sometimes appears. But I think it's a way of reflecting on that balance and achieving that balance. So
I think you're right, and it's an important point. I don't actually know how this will fit into the paper if it does at all.
Okay.
Something to think about.
Again, just sort of thinking out loud here, I'm not sure I have actually a point. I'm just gonna say that the sub bullet there totally resonates with me. In fact, it reminds me of the previous talk we just heard about the resilience in the economic environment and so forth. But it seems to me that there's sort of this push and pull between that and privacy. It's like, how do we find the right balance between fighting fraud and making sure we know who's engaging in the transactions, and on the other hand, protecting privacy? The first bullet here almost makes it sound like identifying who's participating in the transaction is privacy. And I'm stumbling over that a little bit.
No, I think the first bullet is saying, if you've got super strong privacy protection, then you kind of can't prevent some of the types of fraud that are happening because you don't know what you're being presented
Oh, I see.
with.
So it is pointing out that sort of give and take between these two. Okay.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
They almost might be better as kind of two separate bullets. So one is more, what does the relying party need? Clearly in some cases it's their regulatory obligation, but just in general, making sure they're not trying to serve a bot as opposed to a human. So they're going to have needs to some degree. And how do you serve those needs? And how do you do that in a way that maintains privacy, preservation, et cetera? And then the other part here is, how do you think about the entity identifiers, if you will? How do you know it's a real entity that you're releasing your information to? So within the ISO 18013-5 spec, this is the terminal authentication mechanism, which Rafi's on the line and might be able to speak to and chime in on. And it's also, some of us who are familiar with GLIFE and legal entity identifier from a financial service point of view. I don't know what norms are out there to correctly identify. Often we speak about ICANN and certificates, and then that rapidly turns into, oh, but how good a job do they do of correctly knowing for sure it's an entity on the other side. So I think we have a problem space there the paper can point out, but I don't know how far we'll be able to go into making recommendations. But I think it'd be useful to at least start laying out those issues. Victoria?
I think that here, one of the challenges we'll have is that although we as identity technologists assume that everything always starts and ends with the user, I can think of various situations in which you might have intermediaries that might want to do things on behalf of a user. Like imagine someone, like when I did my green card, it was a disaster. It was like so many different documents at different times. And the company I was working for at the time paid an attorney that helped me to go through this. I would have never done this on my own. Or like think people that have difficult tax situations. So you often have those intermediaries, and you can think of a world in which those intermediaries might be AIs or simple workflows. So this idea of like whether it's an actual human visitor or a bot might not be as like a bot is not necessarily bad. It might be like an authorized bot. And so I think that I don't know how deep we should go in there in the paper, but if we don't acknowledge this and we just assume that the user is always the gateway through which all of those operations happen, we'd be remiss, because in a number of situations, it's not just a matter of a user having control over what we're doing, is the user being unable to navigate all the requirements that whatever transaction we're trying to do will impose on them.
One of the, so I know we are short on time. There's other slides, but this is literally the first time I'm having this conversation in a room. So I expect to iterate on this and just continue chatting going forward. I think there's so many entities trying to solve these problems at the same time that they're colliding. And that's making matters worse and not better. I can point to, as an example, the fact that the browser vendors feel motivated to protect user privacy and prevent tracking. Really? And what are they going to break? Because everybody wants to own that we're here to help. I think with the government issued credentials, you know, the governments are now trying to do some of their part and some of their components, but companies then try to do their own things. And there's a lot of, anybody ever play bumper cars? It's like playing bumper cars. I would love it if this paper helps start teaching people that there are lanes and it's okay to trust that people will stay in their lanes and you know what they're going to do in their lanes. We'll see if we can get there. All right, looking at the time, as I said, there are other slides. They are all going to be released. There's lots of fun questions. And I think with that, I need to hand over to Gail to wrap up.
Yeah, I think we're in a good place. Actually, before we completely wrap your session, if you can stay up for a couple of minutes, I was going to ask some of the representatives of the other organizations if they have any closing comments, since we have the benefit of having Jake from Epic on the line, Kay from Kantara on the line, and Mike and Laffy from AMVA. Just want to see if they had any kind of parting comments to the community. Jake, shall we start with you? Did you want to chime in and share any thoughts?
Hi, well, I certainly really appreciate the thoughtful conversation. It's been great for me to listen to as someone who works in the privacy world, on the legal side and less on the technical side. So I think I've learned a lot, and otherwise I'm excited to continue the discussion going forward.
All right, great. Thank you so much, Jake. And I know you helped Heather to frame up some of these questions in advance. So thanks for your contribution so far and for Epic joining in to try and work this through. I think it's fantastic to have such a privacy thought leader as Epic and yourself to join us. So thank you, Jake. Moving on to Kay. Kay, are you still with us? Do you have any comments to share?
Well, thanks, Gail. I really appreciated just the opportunity to sit and listen, and all the things that people have raised, I found very thought-provoking. So I'm kind of excited, and I'm really glad that it's Heather and not me who's going to take all this input and figure out how to make sense out of it. No, truly, it is the kind of thing, it's so timely. It's so important to think this through and figure things out and raise the right questions. So I'm really grateful, and thank you for making this a part of your meeting today and for letting me sit in on this session. And I appreciate the input from so many different folks, and from everyone who really is trying to think about this in what I would describe as a forward-looking way. So, how do we take sort of where we are and where we want to be? How do we figure out, what that looks like? And I just think that that's a really important attitude, if you will, or philosophy to have. I think that it will result in a really good product, and I'm excited for the white paper and for all of those of you willing to share your thoughts and recommendations and all. So thanks.
Okay, perfect. Thank you, Kay, and thanks to the Kantara board for supporting this effort and obviously jointly funding some of the investment needed. And of course, Heather is not just leading the white paper, she's also helping to document the recommendations out of the PEMC, the Privacy Enhancing Mobile Credential Working Group. So she's got two hats as far as this work is concerned. And last but not least, to Mike and to Lafi and Amba, any parting comments from yourselves?
Yeah, on behalf of myself and Lafi, this is a big topic. It's got a lot of nuances in it, and it's one that needs to be that we need to discuss, and we're happy to be part of it. So we're looking forward to the road ahead.
All right, fantastic. Thank you. It's a continuation of a couple of years of work already, isn't it, Mike and Lafi? So thank you for chiming in on this effort. Again, the goal is to kind of bring in voices from outside of the typical community of not just Kantara and EPIC and the OpenID Foundation and AMVA, but also to reach out more widely to the community. So maybe in that spirit, you could just share for a moment what the plan is over the next 6 months, how you're thinking about the listening sessions and kind of moving through the draft process.
So I have set a couple of deadlines for what I'm trying to do. First, listening sessions in settings like this, in one-on-one calls, in Twitter debates. I'm going to take input any way I can. I'd like to have an outline for what I want this paper to be structured as by the end of this month. Prior to IIW next month, I should be able to have polished up these questions. I mean, a lot of these questions are like how I was taught to make spaghetti, where you just start throwing it at the wall to see if it's actually stuck, and that's how you know it's done. I know it's sacrilege, but you have no idea what I grew up with. So but this was a lot like that. This was a lot of, let me just toss stuff out there. And the next time I have a listening session in November, it's going to be much more polished up to say, all right, here's where I think we're going. Now let's really dive into some of the nuances, as he's pointed out, that because there's a lot in this paper. By, I want to say mid-December, I want to have a rough draft that can be out there for people to start to react to. Then iterate on that and ultimately have this ready and done for publication by the end of March. So 6 months. Now, one of the things I can tell you, and I'm happy and sad to know this in advance, is this paper is going to highlight the need for a lot more papers. So, I mean, there's going to be sections that could literally be their own book, and we'll need to acknowledge that those are a thing and make sure that we're clear that, yes, we know that fraud is a problem, but fraud is almost its own beast. So let's acknowledge it, say it has implications, and then back away slowly.
You'll certainly keep us honest. And I think between the two papers you've heard us talking about, the government white paper and privacy, we're kind of approaching similar issues. And we're making sure that work is complementary and that they dovetail together. And your roadmap for future papers.
Pretty much.
Oh dear. Any parting questions or comments from the group here or anyone else online? We're obviously thankful for you all voting with your feet to rock up here, recognizing a lot of familiar faces. So thank you. I know this is just the beginning of the journey. Any final comments from the online group? All right. All right, in the absence of comments, I think we'll wrap up the formal session now. Thank you for your time and looking forward to your engagement in the projects ahead. Thank you so much. That's a wrap.